This lecture is about Korea's economic diplomacy. So there are two themes combined together for this lecture. On the one hand, of course, there is Korea's economic growth, and on the other hand, there is Korea's diplomacy. So there are two themes which combine to make this lecture. So let us begin with my favorite graph, which is Korea's per capita GDP for the past 60 years. So it begins in 1953. What happened in 1953? There was a Korean War, which was fought between 1950 and 1953, and it ended in the form of truce, armistice, on July 27th, 1953. At the time, Korea's per capita GDP, as you can see on this graph, was invisible. It was below $100. So at the end of the Korean War, July 1953, Korea was one of the poorest countries in the whole world. And after 60 years, then of course it began to grow gradually, linearly, up until 1986. 1986, as you can see, that growth, up until that time, it was linear, but in 1986, it began to grow exponentially. And, well, of course, this graph stops at 2013, and then now we are in 2018, and it is per capita GDP is well over 30,000, and Korea's total GDP, that's $1.7 trillion, which makes Korea the 12th largest GDP producer in the whole world. Do you know which country is the 11th? Russia. Russia's GDP is almost the same with Korea's. It's a little more than Korea's. Do you know which one is the 10th? Canada. Anybody from Canada? Right. Canada is the 10th GDP producer, and then again, it is a little more than Korea's. So, where per capita GDP after 60 years is well over 30,000, and the total GDP, it puts Korea as the 12th GDP producer, which is not much smaller than Canada's or Russia's. So that, in fact, is an achievement Korea could make for the past 60 years, and I think it is for that reason that quite often, people say it was a miracle. But at the same time, there is no miracle. There are very good reasons why Korea could develop its economy. And of course, Koreans worked very hard. You must have known some Korean students. Korean students study very hard. And then we were very lucky in the sense that we had very capable government officials who in fact came up with very effective economic development policy. But at the same time, we enjoyed very favorable international economic environment. So all of these factors put together, working hard, good policy, and then favorable economic environment, international economic environment. But on top of it, Korean diplomacy had a small role to play. So that's the story I'm going to share with you today. Korea's economic development, well, it was in a sense, very successful process, but at the same time, what role Korean diplomacy played in the process? 60 years, of course, is a long time. So I tried to just split it into 4 different periods. And then as you could see, first period that runs from 1948 to 1960. Second period from 1961 to 79. Third period from 1980 to 97. And fourth period, 1997 and up until today. So this is the rule of the game. And then the rule of the game is, for each period, I will share with you the challenges of the time, as well as how we responded, how Korea responded to those challenges. That's what I'm going to do for each period. And when I'm done with those challenges and responses, my views on those challenges and responses, then I will turn to you. And on the basis of what you have heard from me, I invite you to raise questions and comments. How about that? Everybody agrees? Okay. So as a recognition of your understanding of the rule of the game, I will say good morning and you will answer me back, right? Good morning! Good morning. Thank you so much. So we will start. First period from 1948, did I shout too loudly? I hope I didn't. Right. The first period, it was from 1948 to 1960. What were the challenges? Well, there was Japanese colonial occupation of Korea for 36 years, from 1910 to 1945. And then after that, immediately after that, there was a Korean War from 1950 to 1953. So after that, as I already told you, Korea was a very poor country, one of the poorest countries in the whole world. So what was the challenge? Day-to-day survival was the challenge. Day-to-day survival was the challenge. And how did we cope? How did we respond? There was no other way than for Korea to depend upon aid, overseas aid. And we depended upon aid for everything, for food, for fuel, for fund, which I just called 3 Fs, right? And then much of it came from the United States in the form of bilateral aid. So there was something called, rather well-known program, which was called PL 480. And then PL stands for Public Law 480. And then it was a program through which United States was providing its superfluous agricultural products with the poor countries of the time. And then Korea at that time, that is to say 1950s, Korea was one of the major recipients of those PL 480 agricultural products. But at the same time, agricultural products on top of agricultural products, then of course there was much cash aid as well. And then that cash aid, in fact, was responsible for 70%, no less than 70% of Korea's total imports. So that was the time. We depended a lot on outside aid. But bilateral aid was not the only source. There was multilateral aid as well. And in terms of multilateral aid, then of course there was an agency called UNCRA, which stands for United Nations Korea Reconstruction Agency. And then somehow when I say we, I, and then my very capable team, we could dig up some film from the UN archive of UNCRA activities here in Korea. It is not as much fun as Avenger 2, I tell you, but at the same time could be more interesting than my lecture. So we will try to look at it.
Millions of dollars worth of goods and machines and supplies were brought to Korea from all parts of the Western world. At one time, recently, there were 17 ships on the high seas converging on Korea.
there's a very interesting project for the building of new houses just outside Seoul. There we've brought in some machines from South Africa with which you can make compressed earth blocks. You put a little cement with it, make these blocks very quickly, and they're building very charming Korean type houses with them.
이 감나무는 내가 낳기도 전부터 있었다 한다.
Did you like it? Short quiz. At the time of 1953, back then, how large was the percentage of Korean farmers? How large was the percentage of Korean farmers? In the Korean population, in the whole Korean population, how large was the percentage of Korean farmers? 60%. Right. Well, I hope I had some prize. Thank you so much. And then by now it is well below 5%, so that again would be another indicator of long economic path that we have come since that time. But at the same time, well, if you have watched this UNCRA strip rather closely, then there would have been several points which could have come up in your mind, particularly those of you. I know many of you are interested in the issue of overseas development aid, ODA. So those of you who would be interested in ODA issue, there would have been several conspicuous points which could have come up in your mind, which is these days when we talk about ODA, then there are two themes which we focus very narrowly upon. One, health. Two, education. I'm not saying they are not important. Well, as a matter of fact, UNCRA, more than 10% of their project was on health, improvement of health for Koreans at the time. More than 10% of the project, it was for Korean education at the time. But at the same time, one thing which in fact looked very conspicuous in my mind when I was studying this material was somehow UNCRA, it was allocating a lot of fund for industry. And then you'd have noticed that there were two plants which were built by UNCRA with the assistance from UNCRA. One of them was what? Cement factory. Another was what? Flat glass factory, right? Both of them. Why do you need cement? Why do you need the flat glass? Both of them, they are for construction. Right? So I think it was a very wise allocation of fund for UNCRA in the sense that where they in fact did something about education, they did something about health, but at the same time they in fact were laying the ground for industrialization of Korea at the time. So when I was studying this UNCRA archive, that was the first point which came up in my mind. Second point was privatization. As soon as they completed construction of cement factory, as soon as they were done with construction of flat glass factory, what did they do? They privatized it. Again, I think it was a very wise decision on the part of UNCRA. And then of course UNCRA was not working alone. UNCRA was working very closely in cooperation with Korean government at the time. And I think it was a very good decision in the sense that rather than keeping those plants in the government, they just privatized it. Again, laying the good ground for industrialization of Korea, early industrialization of Korea. That was the second point which came up in my mind. Third point is, again, if you watched this UNCRA film closely, you would have noticed it in the sense that the agent general of UNCRA, agent general, of course, he was the highest ranking officer for UNCRA at the time, agent general of UNCRA, he in fact expresses his observation about the UNCRA activities in Korea and he talks again and again about the spirit of self-help. I mean, Korea was a recipient of aid, but at the same time, they were not just receiving it for consumption. They were just trying to utilize it for further economic development of Korea. So that was the spirit of self-help. So those were the three things which, in fact, looked rather conspicuous in my mind. Another, in fact, very interesting developments during that period of time that I want to share with you this morning is, I told you about bilateral aid, I told you about multilateral aid, and of course, they played very important role for early economic development of Korea at the time. But the third point I want to share with you would be this, which is something called import substitution industries. And then import substitution industries of that time, we benefited enormously because of Korean entrepreneurship. And when I say that, then of course, we didn't have chaebols at the time, but even then, we had large number of aspiring Korean business houses, in fact, who were trying to make all the efforts they could in order to do something about Korea's economic development, even in a very difficult period of time. So I still remember, I was born in 1956, and then what I still remember is this, which is that, well, for toothpaste, there was only one brand, which was Lucky, right? And the first time I came to the United States was back in 1981, and I went into a supermarket, and then I was quite embarrassed and perplexed in the sense that there were more than 20, more than 30 different brands of toothpaste, and I couldn't believe it. But in Korea, we started with import substitution industry, and one toothpaste I still remember is Lucky. And then that was possible because of Lucky Business House. When it comes to radio, the only radio I remember from that period of time is Gold Star. Why? Because it was the only business house, in fact, which was in fact capable of producing radios. When it comes to textile, Samsung was there. And then when it comes to buses and trucks, of course, in order to produce buses and trucks, you need more capital than when you manufacture, say, toothpaste or radio or textile. In order to produce trucks and buses and automobiles, then of course you need far more capital investment, which we didn't have at the time. So what happened was, there were a large number of garage shops, and those garage shops, in fact, they somehow acquired military jeeps, military trucks, GMC trucks, and they turned them into buses and trucks. So that's how import substitution industry developed at the time. And then you have noticed it. Lucky Gold Star, that of course is one of chaebols these days, LG, right? Samsung, of course they make all those, electronic products, including my Galaxy phones these days, right? And then garage shop, Hyundai, of course, that is the third or fourth largest manufacturer of automobiles these days. That's how Korean economy began to develop at that period of time. What role did diplomats play in the process? I've been a diplomat for 40 years, but I have to confess to you, at that time, back in 1950s, then diplomacy didn't have much role to play, right? But even then, back in 1951, that was during the period of war, there were how many diplomats at the time? 39. How many do we have today? 2,500. So at that time, we started with 39 diplomats. And then how many bureaus we had at the time? We had 3 different bureaus. But one of the bureau, I wonder how it was possible, but one of the bureau, in fact, was a trade bureau. So even if we had only 39 diplomats, even if we had only 3 bureaus, somehow, foreign minister thought, well, one of the bureau must work on trade issues. So one of the bureaus was a trade bureau. So that's what I want to share with you about the first period, that is to say from 1953 to 1960. And as I told you, you can speak to me about your views or your questions. Your turn.
So I wanted to ask, has Korea paid back all of the money that was loaned throughout the past 70, 60 years?
Well, as a matter of fact, very smart question, which is that, well, Korea didn't have much money, and then for its economic development, it in fact had to, well, borrow a lot from the international market. And then did Korea pay it back? And the short answer is, of course, we did. And then in the international financial market, if you fall in default, then your credibility in the international capital market would collapse, right? And then if that happens, then they will be charging you with very high interest rate. So it's very important. If you want to borrow in the international market, then of course you in fact should be paying back. Otherwise, your credit rating would collapse, and that source of funding would become very difficult. Back in 1997, we in fact had something called Asian financial crisis. And that was the time, Asian financial crisis. The crux of the crisis was the shortage of foreign exchange back in 1997. But that's a story I'm going to share with you when you come there. But at the same time, to make a long story short, then of course we borrowed heavily from IMF at the time. We borrowed heavily from United States bilaterally. We borrowed heavily from World Bank. And then of course there was certain repayment schedule. What happened was Korea in fact paid back in full before the expiry of those schedules. But of course we will have an opportunity to discuss a little bit further when we come there. Any further question?
I was thinking a bit about this great big problem with poverty that you had for many years. I'm from Sweden, and we had a really, really small period of poverty in our country as well, from the 1850s to the beginning of the 1900s. But by then, we had also a great problem with immigration. People were immigrating to the United States because they did not find a future in Sweden. Have you, during these times, ever experienced a great immigration?
Well, that students come from Sweden, and Sweden, of course, is part of Europe. And if there is one very serious issue that all the Western European countries have to deal with these days, that, of course, is immigrants, right? Large number of immigrants flowing into Europe from Middle East as well as from Northern Africa. So I really appreciate the question coming from our student coming from Sweden. Let us just think about it. I mean, back in 1950, back in 1953, then Korea War ended. Then if Koreans wanted to flee from the country, then where could they gone? Up to North, which was divided by the DMZ between South and North Korea, right? And then, well, 3 other sides of Korea, that of course is an ocean. And then they in fact couldn't cross the ocean too easily, right? So emigration was not an issue. In fact, there were a large number of immigrants during, say, early period of the 20th century. That was during the time of Japanese occupation of Korea. At the time, large number of them emigrated into Manchuria. Large number of them emigrated into maritime provinces of the Soviet Union at the time. Not Soviet Union, Russia at the time. But, well, after 1953, that was not an issue. And these days, then of course, there are a large number of immigrants trying to come into Korea. So that, in fact, is developing into a political issue, social issue in Korea today. But there's an issue of immigration. Emigration, there was not much of an issue back in 1953. Thank you. So we enjoyed 2 questions, and then I think we can move on to the next period. So who is going to raise the first question?
I want to raise the first question.
Thank you.
You have said that Korea largely depended on external aid in order to deal with the extreme poverty after the Korean War. But there is a view that external aid may lead to aid dependency and thus inhibit economic growth. Was there an issue in Korea as well?
Well, to say the conclusion first, aid dependency was not much of an issue. And then from time to time, I tell myself why that is the case. Because you're absolutely right in the sense that large number of developing countries, they in fact, when they have to graduate from aid, then somehow they're always difficult to graduate from aid. But at the same time, that was not the case in case of Korea. And I think maybe there are several reasons why that was the case. Number one, I think Koreans, in fact, were just looking up at that aid, not in terms of, well, that in fact is something I should be spending on consumption. They in fact were looking upon aid coming from abroad as a kind of basis with which they should be building the economy. So by the time they were graduating from aid, then they were in a position to in fact continue with this momentum of economic growth on the basis of this industrial basis they could lay with the external aid coming in. But at the same time, I think business community, indigenous Korean business community, they also played a role because even if Korea was a very poor country back in 1953, somehow there were a certain number of business houses already there, and they started in their small way of, in a sense, building their own economies, and then they started with very basic, basic stuff like toothpaste, like flour company, like sugar company, like textile company, like radio company, or garage shops through which they were building, or in a sense modifying, say military trucks and military jeeps into private passenger cars and then bus. But that was being done with indigenous technology. So I think there are various reasons why, in fact, aid dependency was not an important issue when Korea was graduating from external aid.